Selina woke up to a strange sound and was startled and horrified to find herself surrounded by a pack of wolves. Suddenly, a giant silver wolf growled and lunged toward her, causing Selina to scream in terror and tightly shut her tear-filled eyes in helplessness. The panic made Selina sob, remembering her parents in the car, who had not been able to hear her since yesterday's accident. It was a heavy rain, a relentless torrent, hammering the old car as it wound its way down a narrow mountain road. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the jagged edges of the cliff on one side and the dark abyss on the other. Selina clutched her stuffed wolf, a beloved toy her uncle had given her during a family trip to the zoo. The soft fabric felt damp under her small fingers, but she held onto it as if her life depended on it. In the front seat, her father gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with strain. Each twist, the road seemed more dangerous under the downpour. The wipers fought valiantly against the rain, but barely cleared enough for him to see. Selina's mother, seated beside him, glanced over nervously, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as if her touch alone could steady the car. Another curve appeared, sharper and steeper than the last. Selina's mother kept looking back at her, her reassuring voice trying to keep her daughter from being afraid, but her trembling voice made her sense that something was wrong. Selina didn't know much about driving, but even at 7, she could tell something was wrong. Her mother's sharp intake of breath and her father's clenched jaw only confirmed it. Her mother whispered, "Slow down." Her father, his voice strained, replied, "I'm trying, Linda." Then it all happened at once. The car skidded on the slippery road, the tires screeching. Her father jerked the wheel to regain control, but the rear end gave way, and the car hurtled toward the guardrail. Her mother's screams were drowned out by the roar of the storm. Selina could barely hear herself as the metal creaked and splintered. The car lurched for a heartbeat over the edge before flipping over. The world spun. The sounds were deafening, glass shattering, metal twisting, the screech of branches scraping against the car as it plunged downward, and then silence. When Selina opened her eyes, the rain had stopped. She lay tangled in a web of branches, her small body cradled by the forest's rough embrace. Her head throbbed and her limbs ached, but she was alive. In her right hand, she still held the stuffed wolf, now damp and smeared with dirt. The trees above her swayed gently, their leaves shimmering with droplets of rain that reflected the weak glow of the setting sun. She tried to move, her muscles protesting as she shifted her weight and pulled herself free from the branches. Below her, through a break in the canopy, she saw it, the mangled remains of her family's car. It lay crumpled at the base of a massive tree, one side caved in entirely. Smoke rose faintly from the engine, mingling with the mist that clung to the forest floor. "Mom? Dad?" Her voice cracked, weak and trembling. She stumbled toward the wreckage, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth. The closer she got, the more her stomach twisted into a knot. Peering through the shattered window, she saw them. Her father slumped over the steering wheel, her mother motionless in her seat. Their faces were pale, their eyes closed. "Wake up!" Selina screamed, pounding her small fists against the car door. The sound echoed back at her, empty and hollow. Tears blurred her vision as she dropped to her knees, the stuffed wolf clutched tightly to her chest. She cried until her throat felt raw, her voice hoarse and broken. The forest around her seemed to close in, its shadows deepening as night fell. Selina sat, huddled near the wreckage, her knees drawn to her chest. The silence of the forest was interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an unseen bird. She tried to summon the courage her father always told her she had, but all she felt was small and alone. Then, a sound rose in the distance, faint but unmistakable. A long, mournful howl. Selina froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Another howl followed, Then another, each one closer than the last. Her mother's words came rushing back to her. Wolves are dangerous. They hunt in packs. Panic surged through her as she crawled toward the remains of the car, searching for any place to hide. She crawled into the wreckage, pressing herself against the cold metal of the back of the car. Finally, after hours, exhaustion took over, and she fell asleep. The first rays of dawn filtered through the dense canopy, casting streaks of pale light onto the forest floor. Selina stirred from an uneasy sleep, her small body aching from a night spent curled against the roots of a tree. As her eyes fluttered open, she froze. Surrounding her were glowing, golden eyes, unblinking and sharp as they pierced the dimness. She pressed her back against the tree, clutching her small stuffed wolf against her chest as a whimper escaped her lips. Her heart pounded like a drum in her ears. The eyes belonged to wolves, their forms emerging like phantoms from the shadows. Among them, a taller figure, its silver-grey fur shimmering faintly in the dim light. It lunged toward her and stopped in front of her. Selina held her breath, unable to move, unable to think, as it loomed over her, its power undeniable. This was no ordinary wolf. For a long moment, Thorn the Alpha studied her. It tilted its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air between them. Selina shut her eyes, bracing herself for what she believed would be the end. But nothing came. Instead, Thorn turned with a swish of his bushy tail, letting out a low grunt that sent the others following him into the woods. The space around her cleared, and the oppressive tension lifted. She opened her eyes, finding herself alone again, save for the lingering paw prints in the dirt. She hugged her stuffed wolf tightly, relief mixing with a strange unease. Though the wolves had gone, a part of her felt they were still watching. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of survival. Hunger gnawed at her insides as she scavenged for food, her tiny hands plucking sour berries from bushes and tearing at bark to find edible roots. Each bite was bitter, her stomach often cramping in protest, but it was enough to keep her moving. At night, she curled into herself beneath the vast, star-speckled sky, the chill seeping into her bones no matter how tightly she clung to her stuffed wolf. She began to notice the wolves again, always on the periphery of her vision. They never approached, but they never strayed far. Sometimes she would catch Thorn's piercing gaze from the underbrush, a silent sentinel as she struggled to light a fire or clumsily gathered leaves to form a crude bedding. Despite her initial fear, the presence of the wolves began to feel less threatening. They were there, a constant shadow, but they did not harm her. Bit by bit, her terror subsided, replaced by a tentative acceptance of their silent companionship. One evening, the cold was especially cruel. The air had turned sharp, each breath a visible puff that dissipated quickly into the dark. Selina huddled beneath a low bush, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Her thin clothing did little to shield her from the icy grip of the night. She pressed her stuffed wolf against her face, its once soft fur now matted and worn. Her breaths came in short, painful gasps as despair began to creep into her heart. She had tried so hard to survive, but the forest was relentless. A rustling sound broke the oppressive quiet. Her eyes darted to the source, and from the shadows emerged Thorn. His presence was commanding, even more so in the dim light of the moon. He approached slowly, his eyes glowing with an intensity that sent shivers through her. But this time, it wasn't fear that gripped her. It was something else. A glimmer of hope. Thorn lay down beside her without hesitation, his broad, muscular body pressing close. His fur radiated warmth, the steady rise and fall of his chest, calming the frantic beat of her heart. Selina stared at him in awe, her small fingers brushing against his thick pelt. For the first time in days, the cold receded, replaced by a comforting heat that lulled her into stillness. Before she could process what was happening, more shapes emerged from the darkness. The rest of the pack gathered around her, their movements deliberate and gentle. One by one, they formed a tight circle, their bodies a living shield against the night. Selina's head drooped, her eyelids heavy. Encircled by the wolves, she felt something she hadn't known she could feel in this hostile wilderness: safety. That night, sleep came easily. For the first time since the accident, Selina's dreams were not haunted by images of twisted metal or the empty faces of her parents. Instead, she dreamed of running through the trees, the wind in her hair, and a sense of belonging she had never felt before. By morning, the sun's warmth filtered through the trees, waking her gently. The wolves were gone, their paw prints marking the ground around her. Yet, something in her had shifted. Selina no longer felt entirely alone in the forest. She was no longer merely a frightened child, lost in an unforgiving world. The wolves had accepted her into their pack, not through words or ceremony, but through their actions. And in their silent way, they had taught her the first rule of the wild: no one survives alone. From that day, Selina began to move through the forest differently. Though small and vulnerable, she carried herself with a quiet determination, her steps cautious, yet deliberate. She knew the wolves were near, even when she couldn't see them. They were her protectors now, her family, in a way she couldn't fully understand, but instinctively trusted. The forest had a rhythm, a language of its own, and over time Selina began to understand it. Days blended into nights under the canopy of towering trees, and the sharp cries of distant hawks became as familiar as her own breathing. Selina moved differently now. She stepped lightly over fallen leaves, careful not to disturb the silence of the woods. Her movements were deliberate, mimicking the smooth, fluid strides of the wolves. Every step, every pause had purpose. She no longer felt like an outsider, stumbling through the unknown. Instead, she blended into the forest, becoming a shadow among the trees. Thorn was always watching. His golden eyes, fierce yet patient, followed Selina as she mimicked the wolves' gestures. A flick of a tail, the flattening of ears, the low rumble of warning. All were part of a silent language she was learning. When she faltered, Thorn would move closer, his presence a quiet reminder that she was being shaped, molded by something ancient and instinctive. She never touched him, nor he her, but the understanding between them was undeniable. Selina's lessons went beyond simple movements. She watched the pack hunt with a fascination that bordered on awe. The first time she saw them take down prey, her stomach churned at the sight of blood. But hunger had a way of eroding hesitation. She realized the pack's precision wasn't random. It was strategy, born of survival. At first, she hung back, trailing far behind as they closed in on their target. But as the days turned to weeks, she found herself edging closer. One crisp morning, Thorn nudged her forward. The pack had cornered a rabbit in a thicket, its small body trembling in the shadows of the wolves. Selina hesitated, her heart pounding. She felt the eyes of the pack on her, waiting. She crouched low, her body tense, and darted forward. The rabbit bolted, but Selina's small frame allowed her to maneuver through the brush with ease, forcing the prey into the jaws of the waiting wolves. When it was over, she sat back, breathless but exhilarated. For the first time, she had contributed, and the wolves accepted her efforts without question. The nights brought a different kind of challenge. Beneath the pale glow of the moon, Selina often found herself sitting apart from the pack. The soft fur of her stuffed wolf, worn and frayed, was a fragile tether to the world she had left behind. She gazed at the stars, her thoughts drifting to her parents. She could still hear her mother's laughter and her father's steady voice, both now ghostly echoes. The grief was a dull ache, always present but manageable, except on those nights when the memories felt too vivid to ignore. She would clutch the toy tightly, tears slipping silently down her cheeks until the first rays of dawn broke the darkness. Selina wasn't the same girl who had wandered into the forest after the crash. One morning, she came across a small stream, its water clear and cold as it meandered through the rocks. Kneeling beside it, she caught sight of her reflection. The face staring back was unfamiliar. Her cheeks were no longer round with childhood softness. They were sharp, defined. Her eyes, once wide and innocent, now held a piercing intensity. She tilted her head, studying her own features. She looked primal. The realization startled her, but it also felt right, like finding a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. Her body, too, had changed. The clumsiness that had once betrayed her was gone. Selina moved with an agility she didn't think possible. She could climb trees as easily as walking, her hands finding holds with instinctive precision. The muscles in her legs felt stronger, more sure. She no longer feared the forest's shadows or the sounds of unseen creatures. Instead, she embraced them, understanding that they were as much a part of the woods as the sunlight filtering through the leaves. Thorn noticed the change as well. He no longer hovered as closely as before, his confidence in her abilities evident in the way he allowed her to venture ahead. But his watchful gaze never truly wavered. On a cold, misty evening, Selina found herself leading a chase. The pack followed her movements, trusting her instincts to flush out the prey. When the hunt was over, Thorn stood beside her, his eyes meeting hers in silent approval. It wasn't just survival anymore. She was part of their world, an integral thread in the tapestry of their lives. Yet, amidst this transformation, there were moments of quiet reflection. Selina knew she was no longer the little girl from the world beyond the forest. She didn't miss the city or its comforts, but she still carried the weight of her past. Her parents' faces came to her less often now, but when they did, it was with a bittersweet clarity. She wondered if they would recognize her now, this wild creature she had become. But deep down, she believed they would. They had always told her she was stronger than she realized. Selina rose from the stream, her reflection rippling into obscurity as she walked away. She felt the pull of the pack, the call of the forest, and the weight of her place within it. For better or worse, she was no longer a visitor in this world. She was a part of it, bound to its rhythms and its laws. As she moved through the trees, her steps light and sure, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. She belonged here. Stephen had never forgotten the day Selina disappeared. The weight of her absence settled over him like a thick fog, refusing to lift even as years passed. 5 years. It was hard to fathom, but the ache of not knowing her fate remained as raw as the moment he'd first heard the news. He often found himself sitting in the worn armchair by the fireplace, a box of memories in his lap. Inside was the small, stuffed wolf he'd given her on her 7th birthday. Its once bright fur was now faded and patched, but it carried the warmth of her smile, the way her eyes had lit up when she named it Luna. Selina wasn't gone. He refused to believe that. Everyone else had moved on, their sympathy now worn thin, but Stephen held on to his faith. He told himself that the wild wouldn't take her. Selina was stronger than people gave her credit for. He'd seen it in the way she carried herself on their camping trips, how she listened to every word when he showed her how to light a fire or how to find edible plants. It was as if the forest spoke to her in a language she somehow understood. The search had been relentless. Stephen had combed through dense woods, crossed rivers, and navigated rocky terrain, but the vastness of the wilderness swallowed his efforts whole. People told him it was pointless. They said the forest was too unforgiving, especially for a young girl. But Stephen knew the woods as well as anyone. He also knew Selina. She wasn't ordinary, and she wouldn't give up easily. As he stepped into the familiar yet daunting expanse of the forest, the air was thick with the hum of life. Birds called from the treetops, their songs weaving through the dense canopy. Every crunch of leaves beneath his boots felt amplified, a reminder of how isolated he was in this vast, untamed world. Stephen carried only what he needed: a sturdy backpack, a well-worn map, and a compass that had seen better days. The deeper he ventured, the more the forest tested him. Briars clawed at his arms. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly, and the uneven terrain challenged every step. Nights were the hardest. The howls of distant wolves echoed through the darkness, each one a reminder of how close he was to the wildness that Selena might now belong to. He often sat by his small campfire, staring into the flickering flames, and let the memories of her laughter carry him through the silence. On one particularly grueling day, Stephen reached a steep incline covered in loose rocks. His legs ached as he climbed, each step a battle against gravity. He slipped once, the jagged edge of a boulder scraping his arm, but he pressed on. The forest didn't forgive mistakes, and neither would he forgive himself if he stopped now. Reaching the top, he paused to catch his breath and surveyed the landscape below. The dense green stretched endlessly, broken only by the silver glint of a distant river. Somewhere out there, Selena could be alive. The thought fueled him as he descended into the valley. Doubts crept in during quieter moments. What if he was wrong? What if Selena was truly gone, her fate sealed long ago? Stephen pushed the thoughts aside, refusing to let despair anchor him. He reminded himself of the stories people whispered in nearby towns, sightings of a feral child moving like a shadow through the trees, always accompanied by wolves. He couldn't ignore the hope those tales stirred, no matter how far-fetched they sounded. It was late afternoon when something shifted. The sunlight filtering through the trees turned golden, casting long shadows on the forest floor. Stephen was resting against an old oak when he heard it. A howl. It began low and mournful, rising into a haunting crescendo that sent a chill through his spine. He froze, every sense on high alert. The howl was joined by others, a chorus of voices echoing through the woods. Wolves. Stephen's heart pounded. He had heard wolves before, but this was different. There was something deliberate about the way their voices carried, as if they were sending a message. He stood and adjusted the straps of his backpack, his body tense with a mixture of fear and determination. The sound was coming from the east, a direction he hadn't yet explored. With careful steps, he made his way toward the source of the howls. The forest seemed to grow quieter as he moved, as though holding its breath. Stephen's pulse quickened as the calls grew louder, each one resonating deep in his chest. He thought of Selena, of the stories, and of the slim but persistent chance that this was the break he'd been waiting for. As he approached a clearing, the howls ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Stephen hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his hand instinctively reaching for the small hunting knife strapped to his belt. He scanned the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. The clearing itself was unremarkable, tall grass swaying gently in the breeze, surrounded by towering pines. But it was the quiet that unnerved him. Just as he was about to step forward, a flash of movement caught his eye. In the distance, barely visible through the undergrowth, he saw them, wolves. Their silver-grey coats gleamed in the fading sunlight as they moved silently among the trees. Stephen counted at least 5, their eyes glowing like embers in the twilight. He didn't dare move, his breath shallow as he watched the pack. One wolf, larger than the rest, emerged from the shadows. It stood still, its gaze locked onto him. Stephen's grip on his knife tightened, though he knew it would be useless against such a creature. The wolf didn't growl or bare its teeth. Instead, it regarded him with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. For a moment, man and beast stared at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, the wolf turned and disappeared into the trees, the rest of the pack following close behind. Stephen exhaled shakily, his mind racing. Was it a warning or an invitation? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. He was closer than he'd ever been. Stephen pushed through the undergrowth, his boots crunching over damp leaves and twigs. The sun hung low, its golden light filtering through the dense canopy. Every step felt heavier as his body screamed for rest, but his heart drove him forward. He had been searching for hours, following faint trails and distant howls, guided by sheer determination and the faint hope that Selina might still be alive. As he emerged from the dense trees, a clearing unfolded before him. It was a quiet, almost ethereal space, surrounded by towering pines, their needles whispering in the gentle wind. At the center stood Selina. For a moment, Stephen froze, his breath catching in his throat. She was not the little girl he remembered. Her long hair hung in wild, unkempt strands, and her clothes were little more than tattered remnants. Yet, her posture was steady, her eyes sharp and alert, exuding a strength he had never seen in her before. Stephen's gaze fell to her hand, where she clutched the familiar plush wolf he had given her years ago. It was worn, its once soft fur matted and dulled by time. That simple toy was enough to erase any doubt. "Selina!" he called out, his voice cracking under the weight of relief and emotion. Selina turned sharply, her gaze meeting his. For a fleeting second, her expression was unreadable, a mix of confusion and distant recognition. Memories flickered in her eyes, but they were clouded, like a half-forgotten dream. Stephen took a step forward, arms reaching out instinctively, but he stopped when he saw her hesitation. She wasn't alone. The wolves emerged from the shadows, their sleek forms moving with calculated precision. They formed a protective circle around her, their eyes glinting with both intelligence and warning. At the forefront stood Thorn, his massive frame dwarfing the others. His silvery coat shimmered in the fading light, and his golden eyes locked onto Stephen with an intensity that made him pause. Stephen raised his hands slowly, his heart pounding. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. "Selina. It's me. It's Uncle Stephen." Selina remained rooted in place, torn between the two worlds colliding before her. The wolves were her family now, the ones who had protected and guided her when she had no one else. But the man standing before her was a thread to her past, a past she had buried but never truly forgotten. She glanced at Thorn, who had taken a single step forward, his stance a silent declaration of authority. His eyes flicked between Selina and Stephen, as if weighing the situation, his muscles coiled with tension. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Stephen felt the weight of Thorn's gaze and knew he was being assessed. He met the wolf's eyes, holding his ground despite the primal fear prickling at his skin. "I've been looking for you," Stephen said, his voice trembling but steady. "Every day I've been looking. You're not lost anymore, Selina." Selina's fingers tightened around the wolf plush, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She took a tentative step forward, then stopped, turning back to Thorn. Her hand reached out to rest on his fur, a gesture of reassurance and gratitude. Thorn didn't move, his steady presence a silent anchor. Stephen dared to inch closer. "Selina," he said gently, his voice breaking the fragile silence. "You don't have to stay here. You can come home." Selina's head turned back toward Stephen, her eyes flickering with a mix of yearning and doubt. The memories of warm nights by the fire, Stephen's laughter, and the comfort of a home she once knew tugged at her heart. But leaving meant breaking the bond she had formed with the wolves, with Thorn. She had become one of them, and the thought of walking away felt like tearing a piece of herself apart. Thorn's low growl rumbled through the clearing, not threatening, but firm. Selina knelt beside him, her forehead brushing against his fur as she whispered something Stephen couldn't hear. When she rose, her decision was written in her hesitant movements. She turned toward Stephen, her steps slow and deliberate. Each one felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of her choice was pressing down on her. When she reached him, Stephen enveloped her in a tight embrace, tears streaming down his face. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now." But as he held her, Selina's gaze lingered over his shoulder, back to the clearing. Thorn stood motionless, his golden eyes locked onto hers. There was no anger, only a profound sadness in his expression. Selina's hand instinctively tightened around the wolf plush, as if anchoring herself to both worlds. Stephen pulled back slightly, looking into her face. "You're coming home," he said, his tone filled with relief. Selina nodded, but her eyes told a different story. They were filled with longing and a silent promise to the wolves she was leaving behind. As Stephen guided her away, Selina looked back one final time. Thorn remained in the clearing, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. He didn't follow, his steady gaze the only goodbye he offered. The other wolves retreated into the shadows, their movements seamless and soundless. Selina's steps faltered, but Stephen's hand on her shoulder urged her forward. The forest grew quieter as they walked, the only sound the rustle of leaves beneath their feet. Selina didn't speak, her mind replaying the moment she had left the clearing, the pain of separation etched into her heart. But even as the wolves disappeared from sight, she could feel Thorn's gaze, a lingering presence that would never truly fade. The day Selina stepped out of the forest and back into the world of men, the cameras were already waiting. Word of her return had traveled faster than the wind, fueled by the mystery of her story. The girl raised by wolves, reporters shouted her name, photographers jockeyed for position, and the relentless click of shutters filled the air like the buzz of locusts. Selina stood motionless, eyes narrowing against the blinding glare of flashbulbs, her body tense and poised as if she were still in the woods, preparing to flee. Stephen, standing close beside her, gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Selina," he murmured, though his own voice betrayed the strain he felt. He had never imagined this level of attention. Inside their modest home, far from the chaos of the reporters outside, Stephen worked to create some sense of normalcy. He cooked her simple meals, fresh vegetables, grilled chicken and homemade bread, but noticed her hesitation. Selina picked at her food, her movements deliberate, her gaze scanning the room as though expecting something to leap out of the shadows. At night, she slept fitfully, twisting the blanket in her fists, her breath quick and shallow. "The city's too loud," she whispered to Stephen after one particularly restless night. "I can hear everything. Cars, people, machines. It doesn't stop." Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as if the noise was her fault. Stephen nodded and promised to do something about it, though he wasn't sure what. He began to notice other things. Selina moved through the house with a predator's grace, her footsteps silent. She would pause suddenly, head tilted, listening to something only she could hear. If startled, her body stiffened and her eyes darted to the nearest exit. Once, when Stephen had accidentally dropped a pan, the clang of metal on tile sent her spinning into a crouch, her hands splayed on the floor like she was ready to spring. "It's nothing to worry about," Stephen told himself that night as he washed dishes. "She just needs time." But deep down, he wasn't sure. It wasn't just her movements. Selina's preferences baffled him. She turned her nose up at processed foods, instead gravitating toward raw, unseasoned ingredients. Apples, carrots, nuts, and plain meat. She ate with her fingers more often than not, instinctively tearing pieces apart as though she were still foraging. "You don't like pizza?" Stephen had asked her one night, his tone halfway between joking and incredulous. Selina had simply shaken her head, her eyes flicking toward the window as if something outside had called her attention. Stephen began turning down interview requests on her behalf. "She's just a kid," he told the reporters when they pressed him. "Leave her be." But his refusals only seemed to add fuel to the fire. The world wanted to know what life had been like for Selina in the forest. What had she eaten? How had she survived? Was it true that she had lived with wolves? At first, Selina endured the questions in silence, her lips pressed tightly together, her hands gripping the hem of her shirt. But as time went on, Stephen could see the toll it took. She began avoiding windows and pulling the curtains tight. Her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Stephen tried to broach the subject. "Selina," he began, choosing his words carefully. "You know you're safe here, right? Nobody's going to hurt you." "I know," she said, though her eyes remained fixed on the floor. "Is there anything I can do to make it easier for you?" he asked. Selina looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You've already done enough," she replied after a moment. "More than enough." Her voice was steady, but Stephen felt a pang of unease. That night, Selina lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The faint hum of the city seeped through the walls, the distant rumble of traffic, a siren wailing in the distance, the murmur of voices from a nearby apartment. She closed her eyes and tried to block it out, but the sounds pressed in on her, relentless. And then, cutting through the din, she heard it. A long, mournful howl carried on the wind, distant but unmistakable. Her breath hitched, and she sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. Selina slipped out of bed and crossed the room, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. She pressed her hands against the window pane, peering out into the darkness. There it was again. The howl rose and fell, a haunting melody that tugged at something deep inside her. Selina's throat tightened, and she blinked back tears. She knew that voice. She could almost picture Thorn, his silver coat glinting in the moonlight, his head thrown back as he called out to her. In the quiet of that moment, Selina understood what she had been trying to deny. No matter how much she cared for Stephen, no matter how hard she tried to adapt, part of her would always belong to the forest, to the wolves, to the life she had built in the wild. The tears came then, silent and unstoppable. Selina sank to the floor, her head resting against the cool glass of the window. She stayed there until the first light of dawn began creeping over the horizon, casting the room in pale, golden hues. When Stephen found her the next morning, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. He opened his mouth to say something, but stopped when she looked up at him. There was a calm in her gaze, a certainty he hadn't seen before. "Morning," Selina said softly, her voice steady despite the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. Stephen nodded, sensing there was nothing more he needed to ask. Selina lay awake in the quiet of her room, staring at the pale light of the moon filtering through the curtains. The room was too still, too structured. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional car passing on the street seemed foreign, almost hostile. She pressed her face into the pillow, but the dull ache in her chest refused to fade. No matter how hard Stephen tried to make her feel at home, this wasn't where she belonged. She knew it. He probably knew it too. The days had fallen into a rhythm that Selina found suffocating. Stephen took her to school each morning, his voice gentle as he encouraged her to give it a chance. She nodded, offering the smallest of smiles, but her steps toward the school building felt heavy. The classrooms were loud, but hollow. The other kids were curious, but cautious, their questions veiled in politeness. Selina sat through the hours, her gaze drifting to the windows where the trees swayed in the wind. Her mind wandered to places far from fluorescent lights and textbook pages. Stephen noticed her withdrawal, though he rarely said it aloud. He tried to bring pieces of normal life into their home. He cooked her favorite meals, introduced her to neighbors, and filled the house with soft music in the evenings. But when Selina thought he wasn't looking, she slipped out to the small backyard. There, under the canopy of stars, she could almost imagine she was back in the forest. Almost. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Stephen broke the silence. "Selina, I know this is hard. I know it's all different. But you're safe here. You're with family." He looked at her, his eyes kind but searching. Selina nodded, but her words didn't come. She couldn't tell him the truth, that the safety he offered felt like a cage. Days turned into weeks, and the ache in Selina's chest only grew. She found herself restless, pacing her room at night. The distant howl of a dog would make her freeze, her heart pounding as she strained to hear more. Each time, it ended in disappointment. The city didn't have the sounds she longed for. There were no whispers of the trees, no rustle of leaves under padded feet, no commanding howl that sent shivers down her spine. There was only the persistent hum of a world that wasn't hers. Stephen began to see it more clearly. She wasn't eating much, her movements too quiet, almost imperceptible at times. He once found her crouched in the backyard, her hands sifting through the dirt as if she were searching for something. "Selina," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her eyes wide, distant. She didn't explain. Stephen didn't press her. He simply watched as she dusted her hands off and returned to the house without a word. Selina spent long hours thinking about Thorn and the pack. She remembered the warmth of their bodies on cold nights, the way they moved as one, their silent communication that felt so much more natural than spoken words. The forest wasn't just a home. It was a part of her. She thought of Thorn's piercing yellow eyes, the strength and trust in them, and her chest tightened. How could she explain to Stephen that her heart beat for the wild? One night, Selina couldn't fight it anymore. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while the city noises crept in like an unwelcome guest. The clock ticked loudly on the nightstand. The air felt too heavy. She sat up, her breathing unsteady. Her decision had already been made, perhaps long before she even realized it. Quietly, she slipped on a pair of worn sneakers and pulled a jacket over her thin frame. She paused at the door to Stephen's room, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Her hand hovered on the doorknob. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were meant for him or herself. The city streets were deserted, bathed in the dim orange glow of streetlights. Selina walked quickly, her head down, her destination clear in her mind. The edge of the forest loomed ahead, its dark silhouette against the night sky. She stopped at the tree line, her heart racing. The shadows stretched out before her, inviting and foreboding all at once. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she felt the pull of something familiar, something true. The forest embraced her as she stepped inside. The cool air wrapped around her, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. The noises of the city faded, replaced by the faint rustle of branches and the distant chirp of crickets. She walked deeper, her movements growing more confident with each step. The memory of the paths came back to her, guiding her through the underbrush. She stopped on a small ridge, gazing out at the moonlit clearing below. For a moment, she was still, listening. Then it came, a howl, low and haunting, echoing through the trees. Selina's breath caught, her pulse quickening. She tilted her head back and let out a call of her own, soft at first, then rising with strength. The answer came almost immediately. Far off, Stephen woke with a start. The house was quiet, the air still. He rose, checking her room only to find it empty. For a moment, his heart clenched with panic, but then he understood. He sat back down on the edge of his bed, staring into the dark. "Go well, Selina," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Go home." Selina moved silently through the dense forest, the familiar crunch of pine needles beneath her boots, whispering a welcome she hadn't heard in years. Each step seemed to draw her further into the embrace of the wilderness, and she felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her since the day she'd returned to civilization. Ahead, the trees parted slightly, creating a narrow clearing bathed in filtered sunlight. She paused, her heart quickening. A shadow moved between the trunks, graceful yet commanding. Thorn stepped into view, his massive frame outlined against the soft glow. His golden eyes locked on hers, unblinking, and she felt the weight of his silent judgment. But there was no hostility, only recognition and understanding. Selina dropped to her knees, her head bowed. Thorn padded forward, his movements deliberate and measured. His breath was warm against her cheek as he leaned in, his muzzle brushing her shoulder. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then he stepped back, his gaze shifting to the shadows. One by one, the rest of the pack emerged, their sleek forms gliding through the underbrush like ghosts. The wolves circled her, their noses twitching as they took in her scent. Selina reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing the coarse fur of a younger wolf. It nuzzled her hand briefly before stepping back. The pack formed a loose circle around her, their bodies a living shield. She knew what it meant. She was home. As the days passed, Selina reacquainted herself with the rhythms of the wild. The forest had changed in subtle ways, but its essence remained untouched. The pack moved as one, their silent communication a language she had once known and now rediscovered. Hunting was no longer a challenge. Selina remembered Thorn's lessons, how to approach a target without alerting it, how to use the terrain to her advantage. The forest provided, and she took only what she needed. The thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, reminded her of the strength she had found during those early years with the wolves. On a misty morning, she crouched beside a stream, her reflection rippling on the surface. Her face was leaner, her eyes sharper. The person staring back at her was not the girl who had stumbled out of the wreckage years ago, nor was it the hesitant woman who had tried to fit into a world that no longer made sense to her. She was something in between, shaped by both the human and the wild. The nights were her favorite. Beneath a canopy of stars, the pack would gather, their forms silhouetted against the firefly-lit darkness. Selina would sit among them, her back pressed to Thorn's steady flank as their howls echoed through the valleys. The sound was both a song and a call, a connection to the wild that coursed through her blood. Gradually, the memories of her time in the human world began to fade. The noise of cities, the harsh glow of artificial lights, the faces of people who never truly understood her, all of it blurred into the background. The forest offered a clarity that nothing else could, stripping life down to its essentials. Here, there was no pretense, no artifice. Every action mattered. Every breath carried purpose. One afternoon, Selina climbed a rocky incline that overlooked the forest. Thorn followed, his massive paws silent against the stone. When they reached the summit, she stood at the edge, her gaze sweeping over the endless expanse of trees. The wind played with her hair, cool and steady, carrying the scents of pine and distant rain. Thorn sat beside her, his presence a steadying force. His golden eyes followed hers, as though he too was taking in the majesty of their home. Selina felt a wave of peace wash over her. She belonged here, with the pack, under this vast sky. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. Selina crouched, her hand resting on Thorn's fur. "This is where I was meant to be," she said softly. Her voice carried no regret, only certainty. Thorn's ears flicked, and he leaned into her touch. For a while, they stayed there, silent companions, bound by something deeper than words. As the first stars began to prick the sky, Selina stood. Thorn rose beside her, his powerful frame radiating strength and calm. Together, they turned back toward the trees, their silhouettes blending into the deepening twilight. The story of Selina had become more than just a tale. It was a legacy whispered across the valleys, rivers, and forests of the region. Hunters, hikers, and those who dared to explore the deep woods often returned with their own accounts of a girl who moved like a shadow among the trees. She was never alone. Beside her was Thorn, the massive silver wolf, his presence commanding and his scar a reminder of battles long fought and survived. The accounts varied, but one detail was consistent. Selina and Thorn were inseparable. Some spoke of catching fleeting glimpses of them at dawn, just as the sunlight filtered through the canopy. Others described hearing the low, resonant howl of wolves and, in the faintest outlines of the horizon, spotting the pair standing together as if surveying their vast domain. For those who dared venture close enough, the girl's sharp gaze seemed almost otherworldly, as though she saw through the person and into the forest they carried within them. No one could agree on her age. Some claimed she had stopped growing altogether, bound by the eternal rhythms of the wild. Others insisted she had aged, but with a grace that mirrored the seasons, imperceptible, yet profound. To the old woodsman, she was a legend come to life, a story they could pass down to children who would never see the forest as they did. To the younger ones, she was a challenge, a mystery worth pursuing. "She's not of our world anymore," one trapper said at the local diner, his voice low and gravelly. "I saw her. Not just her, but the wolf too. I swear, they moved together like one creature. It was something you don't forget." His words hung in the air as others nodded, their own silent encounters adding weight to his claim. Over time, the legend of Selina evolved. It became part of the town's identity, a symbol of resilience and harmony. People began to tell her story at gatherings, sitting by firesides or beneath the stars. They spoke of how she had survived the wilderness, not by conquering it, but by becoming a part of it. She was described as both protector and protectorate, a guardian of balance who stood between the human world and the untamed wild. At dusk, when the sky turned the color of embers and the wind carried the faintest echo of a wolf's howl, the people of the region paused. They listened, knowing that somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, Selina and Thorn moved together as one, guardians of a world few could ever truly understand. Selina's tale that resonates deeply, not just because of its mystery, but because it reminds us of our connection to nature, how we are both separate from it and a part of it. Do you believe stories like Selina's could be real, or are they simply tales meant to inspire? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribing to the channel and sharing it with others. We can keep exploring stories like this, ones that stay with you long after they're told.